Chapter 4 Dinner at Fernley. It was just a few minutes before 7:30 when I rang the front door bell of Fernley Park. The door was opened with admirable promptitude by Parker, the butler. The night was such a fine one that I had preferred to come on foot. I stepped into the big square hall, and Parker relieved me of my overcoat. Just then, Ackroyd's secretary, a pleasant young fellow by the name of Raymond, passed through the hall on his way to Ackroyd's study, his hands full of papers. "Good evening, doctor. Coming to dine, or is this a professional call?" The last was an allusion to my black bag, which I had laid down on the oak chest. I explained that I expected a summons to a confinement case at any moment, so had to come out prepared for an emergency call. Raymond nodded and went on his way, calling over his shoulder, "Go into the drawing room. You know the way. Ladies will be down in a minute. I must just take these papers to Mr. Ackroyd, and I'll tell him you're here." On Raymond's appearance, Parker had withdrawn, so I was alone in the hall. I settled my tie, glanced in a large mirror which hung there, and crossed to the door directly facing me, which was, as I knew, the door of the drawing room. I noticed, just as I was turning the handle, a sound from within. The shutting of a window, I took it to be. I noticed it, I might say, quite mechanically without attaching any importance to it at the time. I opened the door and walked in. As I did so, I almost collided with Miss Russell, who was just coming out. We both apologized. For the first time, I found myself appraising the housekeeper and thinking what a handsome woman she must have once been. Indeed, as far as that goes, still was. Her dark hair was unstreaked with grey, and when she had a colour, as she had at this minute, the stern quality of her looks was not so apparent. Quite subconsciously, I wondered whether she had been out, for she was breathing hard as though she had been running. "I'm afraid I'm a few minutes early," I said. "Oh, I don't think so. It's gone 7:30, Dr. Shepherd." She paused a minute before saying, "I didn't know you were expected to dinner tonight. Mr. Ackroyd didn't mention it." I received a vague impression that my dining there displeased her in some way, but I couldn't imagine why. "How's the knee?" I inquired. "Much the same, thank you, doctor. I must be going now. Mrs. Ackroyd will be down in a moment. I only came in here to see if the flowers were all right." She passed quickly out of the room. I strolled to the window, wondering at her evident desire to justify presence in the room. As I did so, I saw what, of course, I might have known all the time had I troubled to give my mind to it, namely, that the windows were long French ones opening on the terrace. The sound I had heard, therefore, could not have been that of a window being shut down. Quite idly, and more to distract my mind from painful thoughts than for any other reason, I amused myself by trying to guess what could have caused the sound in question. Coals on fire? No, that was not the kind of noise at all. A drawer of a bureau being pushed in? No, not that. Then my eye was caught by what I believe is called a silver table, the lid of which lifts, and through the glass of which you can see the contents. I crossed over to it, studying the contents. There were 1 or 2 pieces of old silver, a baby shoe belonging to King Charles I, some Chinese jade figures, and quite a number of African implements and curios. Wanting to examine one of the jade figures more closely, I lifted the lid. It slipped through my fingers and fell. At once, I recognized the sound I had heard. It was the same table lid being shut down gently and carefully. I repeated the action once or twice for my own satisfaction. Then I lifted the lid to scrutinize the contents more closely. I was still bending over the open silver table when Flora Ackroyd came into the room. Quite a lot of people do not like Flora Ackroyd, but nobody can help admiring her. And to her friends, she can be very charming. The first thing that strikes you about her is her extraordinary fairness. She has real Scandinavian pale gold hair, her eyes are blue as the waters of a Norwegian fjord, and her skin is cream and roses. She has the square boyish shoulders and slight hips, and to a jaded medical man, It is a very refreshing. It is very refreshing to come across such perfect health. A simple, straightforward English girl. I may be old fashioned, but I think the genuine article takes a lot of beating. Flora joined me by the silver table and expressed heretical doubts as to King Charles I ever having worn the baby shoe. And anyway, continued Miss Flora, all this making a fuss about things because someone wore or used them seems to be all nonsense. They're not wearing or using them now. That pen that George Eliot wrote, the mill on the floss with, that sort of thing, well, it's only just a pen after all. If you're really keen on George Eliot, why not get the mill on the floss in cheap edition and read it? I suppose you never read such old, out of date stuff, Miss Flora? Oh, you're wrong, Dr. Shepherd. I love the mill on the floss. I was rather pleased to hear it. The things young women read nowadays and profess to enjoy positively frighten me. You haven't congratulated me yet, Dr. Shepherd, said Flora. Haven't you heard? She held out her left hand. On the third finger of it was an exquisitely set single pearl. I'm going to marry Ralph, you know, she went on. Uncle is very pleased. It keeps me in the family, you see. I took both her hands in mine. My dear, I said, I hope you'll be very happy. We've been engaged for about a month, continued Flora in a cool voice. But it was only announced yesterday. Uncle's going to do a crossstones and give it to us to live in, and we are going to pretend to farm. Really, we shall hunt all the winter town for the season, and then go yachting. I love the sea, and of course, I shall take a great interest in the parish affairs and attend all the mothers' meetings. Just then, Mrs. Ackroyd rustled in, full of apologies for being late. I am sorry to say I detest Mrs. Ackroyd. She's all chains and teeth and bones, a most unpleasant woman. She has small, pale, flinty blue eyes, and however gushing her words may be, those eyes of hers always remain coldly speculative. I went across to her, leaving Flora by the window. She gave me a handful of assorted knuckles and rings to squeeze and began talking volubly. Had I heard about Flora's engagement, so suitable in every way, the dear young things had fallen in love at first sight. Such a perfect pair. He's so dark and she's so fair. I can't tell you, my dear Dr. Shepherd, the relief to a mother's heart. Mrs. Ackroyd sighed, a tribute to her mother's heart, whilst her eyes remained shrewdly observant of me. I was wondering, you were such an old friend of dear Roger's. We know how much he trusts you to judgment. So difficult for me in my position as poor Cecil's widow. But there are so many tiresome things, settlements, all that. I fully believe that Roger intends to make settlements upon dear Flora, but as you know, he's just a little peculiar about money. Very usual, I've heard, amongst men who are captains of industry. I wondered, if you could just sound him on the subject. Flora is so fond of you. We feel you are quite an old friend, although we have only really known you just over 2 years. Mrs. Ackroyd's eloquence was cut short as the drawing-room door opened once more. I was pleased at the interruption. I hate interfering in other people's affairs, and I had not the least intention of tackling Ackroyd on the subject of Flora's settlements. In another moment, I should have been forced to tell Ackroyd as much. You know Major Blunt, don't you, Doctor? Yes, I said. A lot of people know Hector Blunt, at least by repute. He has shot more wild animals in unlikely places than any man living, I suppose. When you mention him, people say, Blunt, you don't mean the big game man, do you? His friendship with Ackroyd has always puzzled me a little. The two men are so totally dissimilar. Hector Blunt is perhaps 5 years Ackroyd's junior. They made friends early in life, and though their ways have diverged, their friendship still holds. About once in 2 years, Blunt spends a fortnight at Fernley, and an immense animal's head with an amazing number of horns, which fixes you with a glazed stare as soon as you come inside the front door, is a permanent reminder of the friendship. Blunt had entered the room now with his own peculiar, deliberate yet soft-footed tread. He is a man of medium height, sturdily and rather stockingly built. His face is almost mahogany colored and is peculiarly expressionless. He has grey eyes that give the impression of always watching something that is happening very far away. He talks little, and what he does say is said jerkily, as though the words were forced out of him unwillingly. He said now, "How are you, shepherd?" in his usual abrupt fashion, and then stood squarely in front of the fireplace, looking over our heads as though he saw something very interesting happening in Timbuktu. "Major Blunt," said Flora, "I wish you'd tell me about these African things. I'm sure you know what they all are." I have heard Hector Blunt described as a woman hater, but I noticed that he joined Flora at the silver table with what might be described as a lacerty. I don't know what that word is. They bent over it together. I was afraid Mrs. Ackroyd would begin talking about settlements again, so I made a few hurried remarks about the new sweet pea. I knew there was a new sweet pea because the Daily Mail had told me so that morning. Mrs. Ackroyd knows nothing about horticulture, but she is the kind of woman who likes to appear well informed about the topics of the day, and she too reads the Daily Mail. We were able to converse quite intelligently until Ackroyd and his secretary joined us, and immediately afterwards Parker announced dinner. My place at table was between Mrs. Ackroyd and Flora. Blunt was on Mrs. Ackroyd's other side, and Geoffrey Raymond next to him. Dinner was not a cheerful affair. Ackroyd was visibly preoccupied. He looked wretched and ate next to nothing. Mrs. Ackroyd, Raymond, and I kept the conversation going. Flora seemed affected by her uncle's depression, and Blunt relapsed into his usual taciturnity.